What's up, Hill City Church? So good to be with you this morning, whether you're watching online by yourself or if you're in one of our Church Anywhere groups. I'm just really excited to be with you. My name is Pastor Ben, and I get to be one of the pastors here on staff at Hill City with Pastor Zach and Lauren. And we are continuing on today in this series of messages that we started a few weeks back called The Power of Us. And I was thinking about this idea, the power of us, because of some recent events in the news, recent as of at least when we're recording this. And I was actually reminded of my time living in Florida. And in 2017, I was living in Fort Myers, Florida, which was very close to the landfall where Hurricane Irma made landfall in 2017. And I remember that night that the storm came in. And I remember as the night passed and the sun came up the next morning, and the reality of the devastation from the storm kind of became known. And I just remember, if I was reflecting back on it, I would say it was one of those things where you looked around and there was so much damage, but not all damage was equal, if that makes sense. So everybody had some damage, but everybody also knew somebody who had it way, way worse. And what was so interesting and what was actually really beautiful about the time after the hurricane coming through was that you saw everybody responding to help somebody who had it way worse than they did. So we were pretty well tied up at the church that I worked at. We were serving people and going out and responding and clearing homes and repairing roofs and serving food. And so I was really busy in that direction. And one of my neighbors realized that, wow, Ben works at the church and he's really busy. So we'll take his hurricane shelters off and clean up the debris in his yard. And it was really awesome. And so you saw that all over the place. Everywhere you looked, there was people helping one another. And now just here a few weeks ago, we had Hurricane Ian blow through the exact same area. And it's way worse than Hurricane Irma was. And I've been talking to some of my friends down there who have made it through Hurricane Ian. And it's amazing to really see how the community and the people who wouldn't normally interact or cross paths with one another, how they were reaching out and serving one another. It's just so interesting. And this idea of a crisis and how it creates community so kind of instantaneously. But I was thinking about this series we're in, The Power of Us, and the Bible talks about this idea of carrying one another's burdens. And so beyond the organized relief efforts coming in, post a hurricane, what you see is just individuals and families and churches and small communities and neighborhoods really embodying this idea of carrying one another's burdens. And there's so much power in that. I had a friend, her name is Amanda, whose mom lost her house due to floodwaters in Hurricane Ian. And they went back the day after the storm cleared. And once the roads were passable and the storm surge had receded, they went and they were trying to recover what was left of her house and her furniture, which was really only 2 or 3 really belongings. But one of the things was an outdoor table that she loved, that her mom had loved. And they were trying to figure out how to get it out of there because everything else was going in a dumpster to get thrown away. And sure enough, out of the middle of nowhere, some fellas in a pickup truck were driving by and asked if they needed help clearing the debris. And they said they wanted to save this table, but they didn't have a way to transport it. And these fellas drove it 30 miles away to Amanda's house for her mother to save the table. And you just see things like that. You see neighbors cooking. I have a friend named Danny who all of his neighbors, their houses were flooded. But Danny's was the one house in this entire neighborhood that didn't get flooded. And so him and his wife have been serving their community, their neighborhood, the people on their streets by cooking meals for them and helping them to clean up debris. And you just see that. And it's really, it's sad to say, I don't mean to be negative, but there really is no better antidote for some of the selfishness that is so prevalent in society today than a crisis. It's just kind of sad to say, but it's true. But it does cause us, a crisis can cause us to kind of pause and consider one another's burdens and kind of this reality that there's somebody, no matter what we're going through, there might be somebody who has it a lot worse than we do. So lots of thoughts and prayers to all those folks. But all of that to say, that's really why I want to spend some time today on this idea of carrying one another's burdens. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the supernatural power of people. So you and me and all of us being in relationship with one another and carrying on one another's burdens, because there really is great power in that. There really is great power when we're united in carrying one another's burdens. And we can see humanity, like mankind, accomplish so much in these moments of crisis. I just turned on the news yesterday and we're, maybe 10 or 15 days past Hurricane Ian making landfall. And there's a 3-mile bridge in Fort Myers called the Sanibel Causeway, a 3-mile long bridge that goes across the outlet of the river and the Gulf of Mexico. And it was destroyed in multiple spots. And they were saying it's going to take years to replace, but they've actually come and kind of patched it, improvised a solution to allow vehicles to get across it right now. So we can do so much when we rally together and carry one another's burdens. And crisis will cause us to do that, but it tends to only cause us to do that for a time. And so if crisis causes us to only carry one another's burdens for a time, I would say this: relationships position us to be available to carry one another's burdens all of the time. In other words, this idea of carrying one another's burdens, and let me just say, it's more than an idea, it's a biblical commandment. The New Testament is so clear in multiple places that carrying one another's burdens isn't just like a good idea or a suggestion or when the opportunity arises type of thing. It's actually kind of the expectation of what being in relationship with one another is supposed to look like. It kind of comes along with the territory. And so as it comes to that, I think about like this idea of, you really cannot fulfill that commandment apart from that idea to carry one another's burdens, apart from being in relationship. If you aren't in ever growing and ever deepening relationship with other believers, that's going to be a really hard part of the Bible to kind of live out in your everyday life and faith. So we're going to look at that a little bit. And I actually want to spend some time looking at a story from the New Testament that involves Jesus. And I'm just going to read from Luke chapter 5, and you guys can follow along with me if you have your Bibles. And I'm just going to share some things that stand out to me in this story. And for some of you, this might be a really familiar story, but it's a story that when I think about this idea of the power of us and relationship and what it looks like to carry one another's burdens, this is such a powerful story to me. So we're going to read from Luke chapter 5, starting in verse 17. And it says this: "On one of those days, as Jesus was teaching, Pharisees and teachers of the law were sitting there, and they'd come from every village of Galilee and Judea and from Jerusalem. And the power of the Lord was with Jesus to heal. And behold, some men were bringing on a bed a man who was paralyzed, and they were seeking to bring him in and lay him before Jesus." Now, so here's the setup. This is a guy who it is literally, I want you to think about this, it is literally physically impossible for this man to come to Jesus any other way apart from a group of friends carrying him there. He is physically disabled. So apart from his friends getting involved, he doesn't come to Jesus. And I know you might be like, well, how does that help us? I don't know anybody who's physically paralyzed, but I would say this: I think we all might know somebody who's spiritually paralyzed. And maybe that's our point of connection with this story. And so if we don't get involved, if we don't get hands-on, if we don't actually take personal responsibility in that type of a way, how will they ever come to Jesus? It's just a thought, but let's continue on in the story. "But finding no way for these friends to bring this man in because of the crowd, they went up on the roof and they let him down with his bed through the tiles into the midst before Jesus." They found no way to bring him in. They could not get him into this church service where Jesus was at. Can anybody relate to that? Like, have you ever had a hard time inviting somebody to church, like getting that friend to come with you? Like sometimes it's almost like a mental hurdle we have, right? We're like, I want them to come. I know they need to meet Jesus. I want them to be exposed to the things of God, but they're never going to come into church. I think it's so interesting that these friends had a hard time getting their friend to Jesus as well. And so rather than take him to a church service, rather than take him to the temple, to church, they bring him into somebody's house. But it says they couldn't find a way to get him in because of the crowd. And listen, I'm a guy who hates the crowds. Like my least favorite thing to do in life is to drive into Cranberry. Like I'm more of an alone in a tree stand type of a guy than a drive into the crowd type of a guy. So I can kind of relate how the crowd can be upsetting and off-putting maybe to some folks. But I think it's interesting, and we can draw some parallels here because I think there's a truth that there are people in your life and in my life who are just never going to come to Jesus as a part of a crowd. They're not just going to stumble into a church service on their own. They're not just going to one day find themselves seated in an auditorium in a church chair or a pew attending a service. They're going to need help. They're going to need a group of friends to actually take them by the hand and lead a person to Jesus. And I think it's so interesting. That's what we see these friends do in this example. But imagine how frustrating it must be, right? Like they've been carrying this guy's burdens. They feel for him. They probably have to go to the store and get him food all the time. And they're kind of like, man, like we're doing all we can to help him, but we know that ultimately we can't meet his needs. We've got to introduce him to the ultimate need meter, and that's Jesus. And so they concoct this plan. They carry him who knows how far on a bed to get him in front of Jesus, to have this man have an interaction, an encounter with Jesus. They get there and they can't get anywhere close to Jesus. And so one of them comes up with this idea of like, man, how are we going to get our friend to the foot of Jesus? I know, let's come through the roof. Listen, I don't care where you're at today. If you have a roof over your head or you've ever been somewhere where you've had a roof over your head, which is pretty much all of us, imagine being in that moment and all of a sudden a man comes down in the middle on his bed. That's what's going on here. And look at Jesus' reaction to this. So Jesus, just like I'm teaching to the camera, I'm not saying I'm Jesus, I'm just saying like Jesus in the middle of teaching, and all of a sudden a man lowers down right in front of Jesus on this bed. And look at Jesus' response. When he saw their faith, he said, "Man, your sins are forgiven you." So what these men probably saw as a frustration, oh, but the crowd, and oh, we carried him so far, and how are we going to get there? Let's do the roof. What the men saw as frustration, Jesus interpreted as their faith. And it's interesting, not the faith of the paralyzed guy. That's not what caught Jesus' attention. What caught Jesus' attention was the faith of a group of friends carrying the burden of their friend. They did everything they could to get him to Jesus, not knowing if Jesus would do everything that he could to heal him. And Jesus' response is, "I see your faith, and man, your sins are forgiven." Verse 21, it says, "And the scribes and the Pharisees began to question, saying, 'Who is this? Who speaks blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God alone?' When Jesus perceived their thoughts, he answered them, 'Why do you question in your hearts? Which is easier to say, your sins are forgiven you, or to say, rise up and walk? But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins,' he turns to the man who was paralyzed and he says, 'I say to you, rise, pick up your mat, and go home.'" Think about what just happened here. Okay, these guys, they recognize the burden of their friend. He can't walk. He is an invalid in life. He is incapable of caring for himself. But we've heard of this guy, Jesus. And because of his physical need, we're going to take him to Jesus because we heard that sometimes Jesus does something about that. That sometimes Jesus heals people who have physical ailments. And they take him there, and in verse 20, it says, Jesus saw their faith, and he forgave the man of his sins. But these guys brought him there because they wanted him to get physical healing, and I just think that it's so interesting that sometimes God will spur in your heart to carry the burdens of somebody, and you want to solve a physical problem, but God ultimately wants to heal a spiritual problem first, and he doesn't give us always what we want. And in this case, he doesn't give the man, even the paralyzed man, what he wants. He gives him what he needs. And he gives him forgiveness of his sins, the ultimate spiritual healing before he meets his physical needs. I just think that kind of stands out to me. God will often do that. He'll give us what we really need ahead of what we really want. So what's the point of all this? And I usually like to teach with kind of 3 points. And as I was preparing and thinking through today and this moment and this message, I had 1 point. Not a super profound point, but I think it's super powerful and potentially really impactful for you. And here's the point. Write this down or take a note on your phone. Here's the idea. This is the main thing I want you to remember. You need a group of people, a group of friends like that. You need that. And I need that. We all need that. And I'm not talking about a group of coworkers or the guys that you do fantasy football with. I'm not talking about your gym buddies. I'm not talking about a group of friends that you're casual with that comfort you when you're having a bad day. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I'm talking about something so much deeper. I'm not talking about the group of people that you commiserate with. Oh yeah, my husband, he's a real bum too. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about, oh, we don't know how we're going to pay the bills, or I'm not talking about the people you whine and complain with. I'm talking about a group of friends that are a part of the family of God. I'm talking about a group of friends that will carry one another's burdens. I'm talking about a group of friends that will rally around a need, or your need, or you will rally around their need, or a common mission or a purpose. A group of friends that are united in faith, brothers and sisters. A group of friends that will at all costs, no matter what, point you to Jesus when life gets really, really hard. And that's what these guys did for their friend. They recognized we cannot meet all of his needs. So we have to point him to somebody who can. And that person is Jesus. We need a group of friends like that will drag you, that will carry you to the feet of Jesus and point you in his direction physically, emotionally, mentally when you can't get yourself there. A group of friends that will try and meet your needs, but when they recognize they ultimately can't, they will take you to the need meter. Because here's what we see to be true. We see it in this passage, and I've seen this in my life, and you've probably seen this in your life too. The truth is that the collective faith of a group of people can move the heart of God in a really powerful and miraculous way. That's what happens here. The faith of a group of friends rallied around the burden and pain of another can move the hand and the heart of God in some really powerful ways. In fact, maybe there's few things that are more powerful than a group of people who have purpose to carry one another's burdens. And you need a group of friends like that, whose burdens you carry, but who also carry your burdens. And that's why as a church, we say we want to be a church that does life together. Not a church with groups like our Church Anywhere groups, but a church made up of groups. You get the difference? Like, we're not a church that just has groups as kind of an offering. We've kind of made groups a key thing that we're doing around here. That's why we have church anywhere, because we kind of recognize that meeting in a building and gathering for church services is not wrong. It's not incorrect, but it is incomplete. That we're not really living the life that Jesus has called us and designed for us to live apart from relationship. If we're gathering together, but we don't know one another, we're not really doing the life, the Christian life, the way that he teaches and shows us to do that. Listen, not everybody's going to have their needs met, their specific needs met or addressed in an auditorium on a Sunday morning. Some of that has to happen Monday through Saturday, and it was designed to happen through relationships. And we see this happening all throughout our groups. There's so many stories. But I think about a story in our group where there was literally a marriage in just the worst type of crisis you could ever imagine. And most of us didn't know what to do or what to say or how to respond, but we were there and we prayed and we got involved to the degree that we could. And you know what happened? God showed up and did what we couldn't do, just like he did for these men in this story. We didn't know anything other than point this couple back to Jesus, be there, support them, love them, let them know they're not alone, be praying for them. And God showed up and he worked and he provided healing and restoration in that marriage. Never underestimate the power of a group who shares the purpose of carrying one another's burdens, because life wasn't meant to be lived alone. From the very beginning of this book, that's what God tells us. He creates man, and then he looks down and he says, it's not good for man to be alone. There are going to be some things in life that you simply cannot handle and navigate on your own. We all need a place. We need a group. We need a people that surround us where three things can occur: where we'll be known, where we'll be loved, and where we will be challenged. That's the power and the potential. That's the calling of a group. Groups have the power to lift us when we need it the most in life. Just like these men literally lifted their friend onto the roof of a house. That's the power of godly relationships, carrying one another's burdens. And I can't help but wonder if sometimes some of us don't avoid that type of relationship because it means that some of your good days are going to be interrupted with somebody else's really bad, nasty days. But that's what ministry looks like, y'all. Ministry is just a little bit messy. It's about running into situations that ordinary people kind of want to turn and run away from. But that is what Christian community looks like. And that's the picture that's painted for us. The Apostle Paul says it like this. In 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 4, he says, God, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort in which we ourselves are comforted by God. That's a lot of words. And in case you're a little tongue-tied on it, here's what Paul's saying. He's saying that God desires to use the affliction, the pain, the trials, the troubles, the tribulations that you've gone through in your life. And he wants to intersect your life with somebody who, unbeknownst to you, is going through something so similar. And because God walked you through it, you're now specially equipped to walk somebody else through it, a similar thing. That's what we see happening in our groups. And I don't know in any other area of life where we're struggling with something, we wouldn't want expert help in that situation. That's the power of godly relationships, that God promises to intersect and intercept our lives with people who have gone through the same thing, so we don't have to walk through it alone, and we can provide comfort by carrying their burdens. That's what Christian community, that's what relationships, that's what groups are intended to do. It's not about making us happy, it's about making us holy. It's about making us more like Jesus. But you know what else Christian community does? Being in a relationship with one another, carrying one another's burdens. You know what else it does? It creates a really powerful contrast to the world's relationships. And it has this power because it's kind of attractive. When I think about the community of people serving one another post a hurricane, there's something really attractive about seeing people serve one another, so much so that my out-of-state friends kept saying, we see what's happening on the news. Can we come down and help? We want to be a part of that. It's really attractive to the world when they see us serving one another's burdens. And that happens in this story with the paralyzed man too. If we pick up the end of the story in verse 25, it says, and immediately the man rose up before them and picked up his bed that he'd been lying on, and he went home glorifying God. But listen to this in verse 26. It says, and amazement seized them all. And they glorified God and were filled with awe, saying, we have seen extraordinary things today. Amazement seized them all, and they all glorified God. not just the paralyzed man and not just the friends, but everybody in that service listening to Jesus teach, including the Pharisees and the teachers. They could not deny the power of the faith of a group of people and Jesus's response to it. I think that us living in Christian community, in relationship with one another and carrying one another's burdens, it may be the greatest evangelism tool that we have, but also the most underutilized tool that we have. Because when a group of people with common faith and a common purpose rallies around a hopeless situation and God shows up, it's like a billboard advertising his goodness and his greatness. And so here's what we want to do as we close. Group leaders, I'm going to turn it over to you, and we're simply going to do this. And maybe you're not in a group today. I'll give you a thought in a moment. But if you're in one of our Church Anywhere groups today, group leaders, here's all we want to do. I want you to spend some time going around your group, and you may want to divide men and women into separate groups for this one, but we just want everybody to share a need, a burden in their life that they're currently wrestling with or struggling with or walking through. Maybe they haven't shared it yet, but create a safe space where there's confidentiality and share those things. And then here's what I want you to do is everybody's going to share a need, and then everybody's going to pray for the need of one other person. And you're just going to go around, and that's how I want you to spend the rest of your time. No discussion questions. There's nothing really to kick around. I just really felt like maybe there's some ministry opportunities in our groups today. And listen, if you're watching this message and you're not in a Church Anywhere group, that's great. Maybe there's a close friend or a trusted person you could call. Maybe there's not. Email us at the office, and one of us would love to connect with you and walk through what it is that you're walking through, and just know that you're not alone, because you're not. And so I think it can be a really powerful time for us to pray for one another, close out your groups, and it'll be a really powerful time. I really sense that the Lord is going to do some really cool ministry things in our homes and in our groups today. So we love you. It's good being with you, and we'll see you next time.